Welcome to ABA On Call. Join myself, Rick Kubina. We have so many studies that show if you have a behavior that's followed by a consequence, let's say it's positive, there's an increased likelihood that that's going to happen in the future. And Doug Kostewicz.
We behave differently because it was determined for us. It's not determined for all.
For thought-provoking conversation. Hey everybody, would you like to get a CEU for this episode? Listen closely for the announcement of 3 secret words delivered throughout the episode. Take note of those words and we will tell you where to go to get your CEU when the show is over. Hello everyone, and welcome to ABA On Call. Today we have a treat. My co-host Doug can't make this episode, so we have a special guest, and that is Kristin Smith. Kristin, welcome to ABA On Call.
I'm so excited to be here.
I am so happy you're here. Today, we're going to be talking about instructional design, and just to let everyone in our audience know, Kristin this is what she does for her job. She is an instructional designer extraordinaire. I think that's even what it says on your job title.
Yes, that's what I put on my resume. Extraordinaire.
So, as we talk, we're going to get into some of the things that you do and how important your experience is. But let's just start off by talking about instructional design. This is something, I don't know what your experience is, but how many people do you think in ABA know what instructional design is or have done it before?
Oh, very few. I think it's so rare for it to even be offered as part of a course in our coursework, in our graduate programs.
Yeah, which is kind of strange when you think about it, because if you want what is ADDIE? The definition is, there's a couple definitions out there, but essentially you're creating learning experiences and you have some kind of materials with that, most likely, in a way that people can learn. That's the essential definition of it. Now, there's a lot of other fancy ways of saying it, but in essence, this isn't so much a science, it's more of a practice in how do you efficiently arrange instruction. And I don't know about you, but like you said, I never even heard of it in my grad program.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that what is so disappointing is that we need to be efficient in how we design instruction, and we need to be so effective in how we design instruction. So to not have that incorporated is really a detriment to the field, to our clients, to our, the people we supervise. So I'm excited to be Dr. Millico, and I keep trying to present as much as we can to, share the knowledge with everyone.
Yeah. And although our audience is mostly behavior analysts, we also have some educators, and I'll point out that they really don't get this in their undergrad program either. I teach in an undergrad program, and when you prepare teachers, you really prepare them to be practitioners, and that's pretty much what we do in ABA. But what's happened is many people in ABA, they take on the creation, as do teachers. And if you don't have some type of education on that, you're just pulling stuff together and doing things however you've learned. So with instructional design, there's a term that I'd like to share with everyone, and it's called ADDIE. Now, ADDIE it's in ID, in the world of ID, it's an accepted colloquial term that stands for 5 things. It stands for analysis, it stands for design, development, implementation, and then evaluation. And those 5 general steps are what's included in what stages you should go through to create instruction. Now, we'll talk more about that in our next segments, but is when you think about instructional design, we're talking to behavior analysts, and it's kind of obvious what they would use it for, but what would be some other areas where, outside of our field, would you see that instructional design is important in?
Oh my gosh. Well, for me, it's like, I always say it's kind of like the Matrix, right? At the point when he sees like all the green coming down, and that's like instructional design. It's everywhere. And so I actually looked up, I was like, if I Google ADDIE, what's going to pop up? Like, where are we going to see this? And primarily, most of it's like designing coursework for like, it seems like college level. But really, instructional design is everywhere. So, we have it in OBM, which is, still behavior analysis, but kind of outside the realm of our population of working with autistic people or people with developmental disabilities. But we also see it in places like business and in military. I went to an awesome talk at the Standard Acceleration Society's conference by Dr. Emily Leeming, where she talked about using precision teaching and instructional design to train military personnel, and her outcome data were phenomenal. Um, and we also see it in areas like military suicide prevention or suicide reduction. And so, I think outside of our normal realm of education, people are applying this in ways that are having a huge impact on the world, which is so phenomenal, right? Um,
That
so
is,
it's out there.
yeah, that's great to hear. And like thinking about suicide prevention, we said, basically instructional design is arranging learning experiences and materials so that people can acquire your content. In suicide prevention, there's going to be specific content that would help mitigate suicide. And that's exactly a role for ADDIE. By the way, we'll use, that's our secret word today for this segment, ADDIE, which is instructional design, not like the ID you have to show to get into the club. And that's exactly right when I think about ADDIE. I have recently been working with some folks in medical school, and one of the areas in terms of medical education is it's all over the place. And I suppose this is even true in higher ed. A lot of people that become professors aren't taught ADDIE like most everybody else, and as a result, your experience when you have a professor can greatly differ from professor to professor because there's no ADDIE there that's gluing them together.
Yeah. Well, and I think, something you see across every implementation is this tendency to like, not in a malicious way, but to blame the learner, right? So like, oh, my students just like won't do their work, or my patient just like won't follow the procedure to change their dressing. Um, and when you look at it and incorporate ID, rather than taking that stance, what you can say is, oh, I need to alter the way that I'm designing my teaching strategy, or, the actual way I'm teaching them to make sure that they are learning and that we're seeing the outcomes and the performance that we want to see.
Yeah. So if I asked you, why is this all important? I think you kind of just answered that.
Yeah, it is. And, I think the thing that I really like about it is for clinicians, so going back to behavior analysis, it really gives us a roadmap, right? Like everybody's busy. We're trying to help as many people as we can and provide as many services as we can. And so it's a nice way to kind of have this is my plan and this is how I'm going to move from point A to point B in a way that's, you know, evidence-based as much as what's out there, and is verified for my learner, which we'll talk about later. Um, and it really keeps people on track and it's very thoughtful.
Well, we talked about how important it is for what is ID, why is it important? Let's move on to our second segment. And we said there are 5 things. We said there's analysis, we said there's development, design, implementation, evaluation. Analysis is essentially figuring out how do you make how do you figure out what's going to be in your program. And I mean, honestly, we could spend 10 minutes on each one of those sections, But let's jump to the development phase. And when we talk about development, people do some kind of analysis. And just to make this, just to not completely skip over it, when you analyze something, you can do research on the topic. You can ask a subject matter expert what it is, or you can look at the literature. You could go on YouTube and see what's out there. So somehow you're going to get your data. But what I'd like to focus on is the development side. And when we think about the development, there's a lot that goes into development. So one of the very first things that you're going to do with development is you're going to draft and prototype whatever it is that you're working on. From there, you produce some materials, and once you have your materials, you'll test and evaluate. You spent a lot of time working on an amazing curriculum. What was that like for you? Like, how did those development steps work when you were creating this amazing curriculum with your team?
It was hard, I won't lie. Because what we really looked at doing, like you said, when you sit down to start to draft, what you want to look at are what are the critical attributes for the skill that you're programming for, right? And as clinicians, especially some of us who have been around for a long time, we come with a lot of experience with different learners. And so a lot of times that influences how we program, right? Which is great. But when we're designing a curriculum for a wide group of people, we really want to stay true to the critical attributes for the skill and then allow clinicians to kind of adjust those as needed for their specific learner. So it was a good practice in going back to the foundations of, what is the skill that we're trying to teach? And then what do we need to control for that skill? Like, what are the foundational and essential, we call them critical attributes, that we need to, define for the skill? And then, how do we develop some variable attributes that the clinicians can manipulate and move learners forward? And because I am a nerd and I love instructional design and I love data, it's like, for me, it's like a dream, right? Like, I love being challenged in this way. But it was just, it was difficult to do that. It was refreshing to go back to the small amount of literature that there is on instructional design and reread everything, and really apply it in a way that's, I think, will really produce robust outcomes for learners.
Just to let everybody know, you and your team have worked on a curriculum called Elements. And Elements would be a program that if you're working with an early learner, these would be critical elements that they need to be able to learn. And you talk about how you crafted your program based on critical attributes, variable attributes, and that's a lot. And walk us through maybe one section and maybe pick one of your areas and talk about what does that actually look like?
Okay, I would love to. So yes, Elements, the way that we've kind of designed it is we are going to have different levels. So you're right, the first level is for, a learner who's kind of in that initial skill push, which they can be of any age. We have, it's tacting and manding and kind of those like, not beginning. I don't want to say beginning because that makes it sound, that you have to be a year and a half or 2 years old. So what we did is in our analysis phase, we went through and we did a compound element analysis of all the skills we wanted to include that we felt like could be in this bundle. So in that analysis, which Dr. Milico talked about with you in a previous ADA on call, we just arranged the skills in a hierarchical way to say how they build, right? So from simple or least complex to most complex. So then once we completed that, we went through and chose, or for each specific skill, we identified the critical attributes. So those critical attributes are the things that define what's being taught. They're necessary for reinforcement. And if you adjust one of them, the skill is a different skill, right? Like these are the exact things. So for example, for a tacting program, like let's say tacting pictures, the critical attributes would be the learner sees a picture and the learner tacks what they see. So if you change that at all, if you change the learner sees an object, that becomes a totally different program, right? Because now it's tacting objects, not pictures. So after we did that, then we went through and we defined those variable attributes. So the variable attributes are the things we need to control for instruction and move. We're going to systematically sequence them after we identify them and then move the learner through that sequence. So we start at point A and we end at, point whatever. And so, for example, going back to tacting, this is like a very basic example. I probably could have chosen a more like exciting skill. But we identify the things we need to control for. And this is where it was complex because, we're trying to program something that we can say, this can be used for any learner. So you can go in and you can adjust the controlled variables if you need to for your learner. But overall, it's kind of a blanket, like here's a curriculum you can walk into for your learner and implement. And it was really, really neat, like just going through and seeing all the skills that we have in place. We have like, I can't remember exactly how many, like 125, 150 in this first level that we did that for. And because we are precision teachers, we're overly thorough. So, it's, we were able to include not just, the basic things you see in like the VB map or the ABLES, but we actually went into like, here's like motor repertoires you need to engage in pointing and engage in toy play. So it's very comprehensive.
What you said just nicely captures this development phase. Now you have to spend all that time drafting this out. You create, you prototype what you're doing, and then you have to produce these materials. And once those materials are produced, you want to look to test them out, to evaluate them, and then that's called, in the ADDIE world, that's called formative evaluation. Some people may have heard of that term, formative evaluation, in terms of education, and that means something different when educators talk about it than when instructional designers are talking about it. Formative evaluation in education just means you're measuring a kid maybe or a student every week, and then you're seeing how well do they do, and if they're not doing well, you change it. But in ADDIE, this all is going to happen, and it's going to be done in the context of how you're designing your instruction. And what is wonderful to hear about what you all did is what you create is based off of design principles, and your outcome is going to be this instruction that's going to deliver the goods, that's going to help someone learn very quickly. And that's what it's about. I think many people who are listening to this might be a little bit overwhelmed when they think about like your process and what your team did. That's just what you do. Like that's all you do. Yeah. Well, you do more than that, but that's the main thing that you're doing. And so you in your past, you had a center where you serviced students with disabilities. What would your advice be to a behavior analyst listening to this who their full-time job is to, they have to service clients, but yet they're hearing this and they're like, well, is there anything I can incorporate? And because they can't just quit what they're doing and then spend 8 to 10 hours after work designing instruction. So what would your advice be to them?
My advice would be that you need to make this constructional. And when I say that, I mean that, there's kind of two buckets, right? Like of how you design instruction. One is this like general bucket. So like elements. These are skills, they're designed for the widest population, right? But the other bucket is the things that are unique to your learner. So even if you already have, like, I feel like most organizations have like templates for instructional sequences, right? Like this is how we generally do a manding program or a tacting program or a self-monitoring program. When you take that, think about your learner and think about your ultimate goal and then adjust it based on that learner. because it's so important that we make sure that what we're designing is specific to our learners and the context in which they are living. Like, for example, street crossing, right? Like, you've got a street crossing protocol where you usually use that to teach a learner to cross the street so they can be a proficient street crosser anywhere. Well, if you have a learner who just needs to walk home from school, you don't need to do that. You can do a cross the street
Yeah.
that's in front of your house. So really being systematic in how you design that instruction for your learner, I think is like the biggest bang for our buck. And then it also makes sure that what you're teaching is valuable to that learner and to their family.
Well, that then brings us to our second secret word, which is development. Well, let's move into our last segment, and that is, with that ADDIE acronym, we're at the E, which is evaluate. And after you have designed and developed your instruction, the next step would be to implement it. Well, when you implement it, it's going to create some kind of data. And if you were an instructional designer and you're like, hey, my job's over, that's just not going to work. And you have to evaluate the outcome of what you did. And if it's not producing the effects that you want, which is most likely going to happen at some level, like I don't know anybody that can design an instructional sequence and then it's perfect for everybody. Like, I mean, it just doesn't happen for anyone. So talk about, what were, as you start launching the program, what would be some things that you'll look at for getting some kind of feedback, and then when you get that feedback, looking at how you make some changes?
For elements?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that, like you said, every learner is different, right? Like, they're going to be moving through curriculum at a different rate just because by nature they're humans and they're different. And so I think what we can look at is, at what point are learners like really struggling? Like, is there a skill where, people are having to implement a lot of interventions to move the learner through that particular instructional sequence? And then, the beautiful thing about in data analysis, and I won't dive into this because I know it's way too comprehensive for our time, but like using a multi-tiered measurement system, so like a micro, meta, and
Yes.
macro level of data, is we can look at, is this a problem with the way we've designed instruction on that skill? Or is it a problem that people don't realize that there's other prerequisites missing? Because I think that a lot of times that's the problem, right? Like, we do a beautiful analysis phase and a beautiful assessment, and we find a skill that we're going to intervene upon, and then we start it and we're like, oh gosh, I started writing and my learner has a pencil grip that's like so loose, so of course they can't write a sentence or do their spelling words. And the problem actually isn't the sentence or the spelling, it's the pencil grasp needs to change. And so I think, we'll be looking at it not just within each program, but across programs, and across how those skills develop. And, that's something we really want to provide to our customers, is not just this, grab a program and work on it in isolation. It's this bigger, complex web that I think is really hard. It's a art to develop that, right? You and I have talked about that. It's so comprehensive. You have to have so much knowledge going in, and to be able to give that to people and say, hey, like, your learner is having a hard time. Maybe think about these other skills and evaluate if these things are missing. And then you intervene upon that. And then all of a sudden the original skill just begins progressing beautifully. So I predict that's the way we'll use data from a big, more macro level stance.
Yeah. When you look at the evaluation, one thing that again, we didn't talk a lot about this, but in the analysis phase, part of when you figure out what you want to do, and then you move into the design and development, somewhere along the way, you're going to create objectives, and your objectives are going to specify your outcomes. And if you don't get those outcomes, why is it? And what you just said, I think, is so important, because you don't know why, if someone makes a mistake, and let's just pull this all back. We're behavior analysts, and everything that we do is to bring a learner under stimulus control of something. And if someone is not under stimulus control, well, why is that? And your evaluation is going to help you figure that out. And it's a challenge because, so you have, as you pointed out, there's so many different learners out there. What is it? Like, let's say that you find out that, wow, Elements works for 95%. Well, what about that 5%? Why isn't working it? Is there something that they're deficit with? Is there something that you could tweak so that you get it to 96, 97%, and so on? And I think the other thing I'd like to point out is that when you create instruction, you're never going to have something that works for everybody all the time. That's just, there's no instruction out there that's going to do that. So you're looking at things like, what is going to work for the majority of learners, and those that it's not working for, how can you modify based off of your evaluative data?
Exactly. And one of the things that is very unique to Elements is that in addition to like the instructional protocols, we have the here's how you implement and here's your step-by-step. But then we also have the section of tips that's basically like, I think Dr. Milko refers to it as like the bread and the butter, or like this is like the part that's actually really rich, because we have tips that say, hey, if your learner is doing this, consider this. Or if your learner is having this type of error pattern, think about addressing it in this way. So that as, if you sit down and you're a newer BCBA, you could see that and be like, oh my gosh, okay, I'm going to try that, instead of problem solving, and then 3 weeks later, you're still in the same spot. And so we really tried to incorporate so much of our clinical experience and give people the tips they would need to implement in a way that's the most efficient. Because, it's, like I said, everybody's stretched so thin, and so we want to be efficient with the time of the student and the learner and the time of the clinicians as well.
Yeah. When I was listening to you talk about evaluation, we can look at this in two ways. I mean, the one way we've been talking about, some of the questions I've been asking you has been, if you were going to engage in some of these steps, what would that look like? But the other way to look at this is, we're all consumers of information. And if you can understand these design elements, then what you could do is say, you know what, I need a program that's going to teach reading. If you had 5 programs out there, do any of them show that they have strong instructional design principles? Because I'm going to go with a program that has people who are spending the time like you and your team are doing. Because if not, you have to ask yourself, how are people creating that information?
Yeah. And that's part of what's scary, right? Is anybody can publish a book. So
That's
anybody
right.
can create a list of, hey, here's the skills. And when we set out to develop Elements, not only did we do that compound element analysis like I talked about, but we also looked at, all these assessments. We really went deep into the subject matter to make sure that the way that we were incorporating skills was really purposeful and as evidence-based as it could be. But yeah, and I think too, as a behavior analyst, it's so hard to evaluate that, because again, you're doing that after you've seen your clients for the day and you're off the clock and you're like, okay, what resources can I find? And so it can be really difficult to determine, what are the things you need to be going toward and using as materials.
Yeah. I think about someone asked me the other day, hey, do you know any really good social skills program? And there's not a lot of good social skills programs out there. And I was looking at this one, and I'm not going to share the name of it because I don't want to put it out there. But it was written by someone who essentially, like, I don't know where they pulled things, but it was these skills that were like in an alphabetical order, and when you look at what these skills were, it didn't look like even the preparation for, how do you greet someone was kind of strange the way this was pulled together. And, as I read this was just someone who essentially, as you pointed out, self-published a manual. And, when you read the very short preface, it thanks some people that, hey, I'd like to thank so-and-so, gave no information on how it was designed and developed. And I was thinking okay, this is probably not going to, I don't even know that the author would be interested in looking at information. And those are the kinds of things you need to look out for, when you're reviewing products.
Yeah. And I also think just even the first thing you can do is, like you said, flip to the back of that book and look at what they have cited. Those citations are so important. And if there aren't many, that's a huge red flag. And if they don't incorporate or they don't include names like Tiemann and Markle or Johnson and Street, I mean, those are specific to the type of curriculum we're developing. But, it's worrisome.
Yeah.
And using those outdated curriculums, which I won't mention names, but using things that were developed 15 years ago, we've come so far since then. And while there is value in referencing those for ideas, following something that is that dated is not always the best choice.
I'm so glad that you said that. I teach a course on reading. I've taught it for over 22 years now. And I have seen reading programs that are based in the 40s and 50s, and because they have a tradition, teachers keep doing those things. And I'm we know so much more from what we knew back in the 40s and the 50s, and recycling these ideas that people think were good. It just breaks my heart thinking there's all these kids who, this is a special education reading program, that are getting this incredibly outdated information, and it's based off of these principles that we know there's a better way to teach. So here's the thing. When you are in this phase and you evaluate, you need to take that information and then iterate. And that happens to be our last secret word. You iterate. You take the knowledge and you say, you know what? This particular thing might need tweaked, but wow, these other things worked really well. And I like to think about it any kind of operating system or any kind of tech. It's constantly being updated and modified so that it can be improved and it become more efficient. And that's exactly what you were saying earlier, that the reason why we're doing this is for efficiency.
Mm-hmm. And the learner is always right, whether your learner is a 70-year-old adult or a 2-year-old autistic child, or the learner's right. So we need to adjust and change in response to performance. So I feel like that was important to say.
Well, Kristin, thank you for your time. We talked a lot about instructional design, and if someone's interested in following up, give me a book that you might recommend to someone who might want to read a little bit more, like behavioral stuff.
Yeah, well, aside from your books, which I love, um, I love anything written by Kent Johnson. I feel like they produce. He's Morningside Academy, and Elizabeth Street. The way they write their literature, I think, is really consumable. Like you read it and you're like, oh yeah, I get that. Like, oh yeah, that makes sense to me. But it's also brilliant. And they incorporate instructional design and data analysis very effortlessly. So I would highly recommend anything they've written. They just had a new book come out. I believe Generative Instruction, I think, is the name of it. But there's many books to be had by them.
That's an excellent recommendation, and that would whet people's appetite. And if they're interested in learning more about this, they could, as you point out, go to the back of those books and see the references, and they would come across the things that you and I have both learned, Tiemann and Markle, who are big names in instructional design from a behavioral standpoint.
Yeah.
I'd like to say one more thing, and that is we have an email address, which is abaoncall@centralreach.com. So if any of you out there listening would like to ask us questions, or you need references, or there's something you'd like us to follow up with on the content, send it to that email, and we would love to get back with you and to hear from you. So thank you, Kristin, for your time, and thank you, everyone, for listening to our episode of ABA On Call.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching this episode of ABA On Call. To get your CEU, follow the link and instructions below the video. You can enjoy the program again there, or you can go straight to the attendance verification quiz. Just enter the secret words and pay the CEU fee to generate your certificate.